And to my mind, it feels like 10 or 15 years ago. It's just extraordinary, really. Although my father's a 20th century architect, 20th century is now a century later. But it was a completely different era in terms of the church to what we find now. Although I do a lot of churches, I do secular work as well, a lot of work with ruins and castles, even 20th century monuments now, radar stations and heavy anti-aircraft gun emplacements. But the bulk of the work is with medieval churches. But I won't find vicars coming up to me and asking for a reordering and a new altar or a new understanding of how to worship. They really aren't interested in the building as an asset. It's more of a hindrance. And how do they get round it? Which is disappointing in some ways, but our father was operating in a different era where everything was looked upon just after the war as a new opportunity to form a new liturgy, form a new understanding of worship. And it wasn't the architect on his own expected to come up with spectacular designs. It was a joint effort where the priests, the archdeacon, the bishops would all look to finding new ways of making the liturgy more relevant. And my father was born at that time where people like Archbishop Coggan was the same age and working up his way as a young priest. And as he says in the foreword to my book, he was the man of the hour. He was always interested in churches, religious architecture. He was about, I think he was 12, and he decided he was going to be a church architect. And there was no particular reason. The family wasn't that religious. His father was an accountant with a shipping firm in London, but he had an artistic bent, and he would go out sketching in the countryside. They'd cycle out into the Surrey Hills, and he would come back with watercolours, and my father would accompany him, and obviously learn quite a lot about how to look at buildings and how to understand basic vernacular buildings. But this overriding passion he had, he knew exactly what he wanted to do, and just very focused, and he just happened to be at that time in history where he was going to be there to make a difference. He was born in Croydon, and until he was about 12, he was just an ordinary boy, he said. He wasn't until somebody says, if you go around chopping trees and being a vandal, you won't pass your exams. And he went, oh, well, I've always wanted to be an architect. I've got to obviously concentrate on my exams. So he sort of changed his whole lifestyle. It's something he tried to inspire me not to go around being a vandal. So. And he went to the London Polytechnic, but in those days you didn't go as a full-time student. You went as an apprentice to architects, and he would actually spend the day with a firm of architects, and then at night time he'd go and do work at college at the Polytechnic. And he ended up understanding the practical aspects, whereas I went to the Architectural Association, and I don't think I did a drawing for 5 years. It was all about utopian villages and communism, and he despaired when he looked at my final submissions. He said, "Where are the drawings?" I said, "Oh, apparently I can do those later, But anyway, so he was of his time in that sense. But what he didn't want to do was just copy the past. He was very clear that he was there to take things forward. Although Gothic was his passion, he felt all these architects in the Victorian era, such as Pearson, Butterfield, had all contributed as creative artists using the traditions, but just taking it that bit further and creating new architecture. And he didn't see why that couldn't still be applied. And just to sort of copy Gothic architecture wasn't going to produce the results that were needed. I don't know how much of you know my father's work, but that is a very distinctive style, and a lot of people don't like it, and a lot of people do like it. And I had one vicar once, I made a mistake of asking a conservator to go to a church at Holy Trinity, Rothwell in Yorkshire, to look at a Saxon stone. And they came from Northamptonshire, and there was a Holy Trinity Rothwell in Northamptonshire, and they went to that church by mistake. And the vicar rang me up, and he said, "How dare you?" And very nasty, really. And then he found out who I was, and he said, "Oh, Pace," he said, "that awful architect does all that spiky stuff." I thought, well, it's a loser here, I won't bother. Anyway, you can see, but the point is, it's a Gothic approach to design, in the sense it has this vertical emphasis, and it's also composed of very simple repetitive forms, which when they're put together produce something quite complicated and quite decorative. That one there is a little finial he did for the memorial chapel to George VI at Windsor St George's. It didn't end up like that, it's slightly different, but he would actually take things, look at them for a long time, and then tweak them and decide that was right. He refused to be hurried. He had this terrible nickname, which I only found out later, called Snail's Pace, which was very unfair, because it wasn't so much he was slow. He was probably one of the fastest workers I've known. I remember he was going to go down to Boston in Lincolnshire, and the train was late or something happened. He had an hour to spare, and he said to one of his assistants, "Well, let's get that pinnacle sorted out." And this was a full-size drawing, and it was a 20-foot high pinnacle. And he drew all the crockets and designed it in an hour, and that was it. And it was given to the masons and wasn't revised. And until you've done something like that, or tried to do something like that, you just don't realise how difficult these things are, and how he knew exactly what was in his mind and what should work. My father was in the Royal Engineers in the army, and one of his jobs towards the end of the war, other than building pillboxes and whatnot, was to requisition buildings and de-requisition them. And he was de-requisitioning an awful lot in 1945, so much that the army said, you've just got to carry on. And they thought it'd take about 4 years to de-requisition everything in the north of England. And he said, well, as I reduce my work, can I start my architectural practice? He knew it was a mad question, because the army, of course, were totally Philistines. But they did say, yes, that sounds a good idea. So he was paid by the army and started his practice at the same time. And he was very lucky. He came up in the war to York. He met his wife, Ina Pace, just before the war, and they both lived in London. She was in North London, he was in South London. They used to meet at Southwark Cathedral in the Blitz. And they decided to get married there. They got married in the Lady Chapel. It was cancelled 4 times, the marriage, because of leave was cancelled or whatever. And the final straw was there's been a bomb just outside the cathedral. It's blown all the windows in. There's no glass, there's nothing. It's all boarded up. I said, I don't care. I'm not going to sort of give this one up again. So they got married in this very dingy Peter Southwark. And that's where they're both buried now, which is quite nice, because it was a spot that meant something, and my father became the architect to Southwark eventually. So he came up to York, and after the war decided, should I go back to London or should I stay in the north? And the north of England, well, it's still seen as rather sort of backward. And he decided actually he probably much better family place to bring up children. And he could always go down to London and look at the RIBA library if he had to, but it was a very difficult thing because nearly all architects who were of any standing were based in London. And the people like Temple Moore and Scott, they would all do wonderful work in Yorkshire for big landowners, but they were based in London. But he met someone called Dean Milner White at York Minster, who decided to take the whole world of church architecture and art forward as a sort of renaissance to try and instill a new life in the whole movement of the pastoral work. And he was very fortunate that Dean Milner White took to him and recognised here was a young man with quite a lot of talent. And he started introducing him to clients. And at the same time, a very good architect called Sir Charles Nicholson died, and he left something like 7 cathedrals without an architect. And Dean Milner White pushed my father's name, and he ended up at the age of, in his early 30s, with Lichfield Cathedral, Llandaff Cathedral, I forgot what the third one was, which was very good, considering he was just really, sort of only just started his practice. And he made a very big commitment, and Dean Milner White was very, very helpful. And he also introduced him to these two very well-known churches in Wales, in the church in Wales, which is Reverend Glyn Simon, the bishop, and then Errol Thomas. Llandaff Cathedral had been bombed in the war, and they wanted it was a parish church, but they wanted it to be a cathedral, and they were asking him to make it into the mother church. And all three of them were very, very keen that artists and creative work would make this into a new era. Yeah, this is him on the pictured tower at Llandaff. I always used to think, well, that was normal in those days. But if you look very carefully, just to the left, you can see somebody's ear. So he wasn't entirely alone. I think that's Dean Errol Thomas, actually. But a lot of people seem to sort of find that extraordinary. But he had this complete lack of fear of heights, and I remember a mason telling me when he first met my father, they knew he was coming to the church to inspect it, and they deliberately took the ladders away so he couldn't get up, and they were having a cup of tea and a smoke at the top of the tower, and this sort of shadow suddenly appeared, and then my father, he had actually climbed up the scaffolding, not the ladder. And he said, this mason said, from then on I realised there was nothing I could do. I couldn't hide anything from him. It would have to be done properly. So, which rather shocked me because I thought all masons did things properly. They're all human. So he was very young, and he really founded all his principles of architecture were worked out at Llandaff Cathedral. And you'll find every era of his design work there, which started off with a classical base, even though he was very keen on Gothic. He still trained in a classical tradition, very much admired architects like Lutyens. But he also admired the 20th century architects like Gropius and Corbusier. And he felt they were on the right track for modern architecture. But there was something about their work that didn't seem to work for the church. And he later identified it as modern architecture lacked symbolism, mystery, and any sort of magic. And he felt the church had to have that aura of magic, which was from medieval times, was always an inspiration to people. And the idea of something built without its context being recognised was very alien to the church. The building is an individual piece of architecture, whereas a modern movement, Gropius could build a factory in Germany and he could build one in England, and you wouldn't know which country they were in. It was an international style. So he had this dilemma. He wanted to be modern, but he didn't want to be brutal and out of context. He felt there was room here to develop Gothic into a modern idiom which would help to inspire faith. And one of the phrases he often used was, the building by its very presence is an act of worship. Whether there are people in it or not, it's a testament to the prayer to God. And he was religious in that sense. He felt church architect should be someone who believed. And I don't think that's necessarily true. We've got to be passionate. But he was in that very much that old school frame, like Butterfield. They were very humble and very strong churchgoers. And he really believed what he was doing was for the greater good, as was for God. Having said that, he still had a very strong belief in himself, and that he was the chap to do it. This is again in Wales. I'm just showing this because that, to my mind, summarises a lot of his approach to architecture. It looks modern, it looks medieval, both at the same time. You're not quite sure what era it is. It could even be Elizabethan. But what he was trying to do was instill the spirit of traditional architecture, different styles, and he was very happy to mix the vernacular with the modern. He didn't feel there were boundaries. He had to leave alone. He was able to take everything and distill it into something that became a new form of art. This actually never got built, unfortunately, but you'll see other things like it. But that doesn't sound terribly revolutionary, I think, now. But when you think this was in the early 60s, he grew up in an era where people, if they're an architect, their main ambition was to design a hospital or a school. And it had to be brutal, and it had to look like something Corbusier had done. And nobody was interested in religion, particularly, in mainstream art and architecture. And if they were, they always felt they had to do some modern statement, like a breathtaking hyperparaboloid or some sort of crazy roof, which everyone would say that's modern. And he was very loath to fall into the trap of producing something that looked modern when it wasn't actually based upon any principles. It was just an aesthetic. He felt it couldn't just be an aesthetic, it had to have a basis, and this is why he wanted to work with the church to go together and find new principles of worship and architecture which would actually work together. This is just an example of when he was a student. He was working as an architect as an apprentice. He did his work at the Polytechnic in the evenings, and after he'd finished that, he did something called the Pugin Scholarship, which was measuring buildings to understand them. And this is one of 12 sheets. They're big. It goes up to this beam. And I mean, it's amazing. He was 19 when he did this. I still don't understand Gothic architecture fully. And every time I look at these, I see something new, and I think, yeah. But they're also drawn in pencil. And anyone who's drawn in a soft 2B pencil and tries to keep the page clean knows how difficult it is. Those smudges are actually a varnish you put on top to protect them. And they were mounted, and they went round the world because he'd actually won this medal. And they were trapped in India during the war, and he thought he'd never see them again, but they actually did turn up. But he said, I've got some very bad news for you, Peter. They're stopping the scholarship, so you won't be able to go in for it. yet. So, I mean, just that ability to understand how Gothic works is phenomenal. So he already knew more than most people about Gothic architecture. And Gothic architecture was his passion. And here we see another example of some light fittings made out of repetitive elements, which make it look incredibly complicated. And that's what layers and layers. But there's only one element there that's cut out in a profile, and then they're all stuck together. And you get this amazing, complex lighting system. And this is in an era when churches had only just started getting electricity. And often I'll see his reports, and it says, this church has electricity. You think, yeah. And he would use a lot of these fittings with different little details. Very rarely did he reproduce it twice. Very tempting once you've done a big drawing. They're all done full size, these drawings. Very tempting to sort of, well, that'll work in this church. But he wasn't. He wanted each church to have its special mark and have an identity, and B, he wanted to evolve the design. Like all designers, you don't stand still. You're always striving, and things are never quite what they should be. And he didn't just deal with buildings. He dealt with the furnishings. Oops. Leaded glazing. Traditionally, architects would do diamond shapes. Everyone thinks diamond shape. You know, you look at a church in a film set, it's always got diamond windows. Architects, Lutyens and Templemore and people like that were going back to that sort of Elizabethan type of rectangle quarries. But very few people had ever worked out what might happen at the top of a window. If you see the typical Victorian stained glass diamond pattern, they just go up into the top. There's no recognition that the tracery is there. They just, the stonework is what counts, and the rest is just a way of putting glass in. There were a few architects who'd done something with lead cams, which is those lead pieces which hold the glass together. But he took it to an art in itself, and this is sort of his curvilinear period, and then he goes into his Mondrian period later, which actually he uses techniques which are now accepted and are written in the English Heritage Bible of how to fit new things into old settings. And he could easily have done what a lot of architects in those days would have done, is put the doorway in the arch. But he didn't. He put it beyond the arch at the back. So A, you're getting more light through it, and B, the arch is fairly dominant. But it's that sense of a medieval approach where he's got the wooden dowels are always left proud. And traditionally in a half-timbered building, you'd always leave the dowels proud because the wood would shrink and you'd have to knock the dowels in every few years. So you always left them proud. But he turned it into a decorative style. And then the handles were all made by craftsmen. Again, all drawn out full size. Every mortal aspect of a design would be controlled by him. And probably the top rail, you might not see it, but there's an incised inscription there. Beautifully lettered, which he would have drawn out. You don't just, a lot of people will get a gravestone done today and they'll say letter it up, and the man will put it in his computer and you'll get a fairly competent piece of inscription, but it doesn't have subtleties. And lettering is an art, it's a whole subject in itself. And he was a master of things like that. He realised how important it was for the design to have integrity if everything had been under his control. I did do some secular work, and this is the great view, which is now a World Heritage Site in Durham. where you have the castle, the university castle on the left, and to the right is Durham Cathedral. This is a new library for the university, and here he put a lot of his techniques of incorporating traditional designs and infusing them into something quite new. And it has he even, although it's built out of sandstone, the Dunn House from Durham, traditionally buildings were whitewashed, especially in the medieval period, but they also whitewashed them to give the stone a chance to harden up and have its own patina. And he whitewashed it to start with, and even I winced when I saw it. He said, don't worry, a few years' time it'll be absolutely fine. And it is absolutely fine now. And a bit like that drawing I showed you at the beginning, it looks medieval, but it looks modern as well. And it's this relating to the context, its position. I mean, you wouldn't put that on an industrial housing estate, and you wouldn't put it in the middle of a timber frame building village or something, but he's taken these elements, he's used modern technology, within reason. There are some steel frames there, but he also knew exactly how to build in traditional techniques. You'll often see today a modern building clad in stone. It has vertical expansion joints. That's because the engineers insist on it, and it's because they use a modern mortar, whereas you use a traditional hydraulic lime, that expands and you don't need to incorporate those sort of details, which totally ruin the credibility of traditional buildings. Now, he also did furnishings, and again, this is an opportunity to produce a work of art. It uses those same Gothic elements of building up a structure which appears to have buttresses, it appears to be strong and stable, but it's at the same time like you'll find a Gothic cathedral where you get all this light coming through and flying buttresses, all holding it up. It's the same spirit, the same approach, and very much an individual item. Again, you wouldn't find that anywhere else. This is for Tamworth. I've got a picture of it as it turned out. Is it? Not quite, no. I think that was wishful thinking. It did change from that first one. But using those nails at the top on the cross, those nails Christ would have been nailed to the cross on, as a very powerful statement. And someone like Graham Sutherland used such things in Coventry, and he was obviously being influenced by other people, but he managed to produce something very few architects do, is a recognisable style. The contradiction there was he wanted everything to be self-effacing. He didn't believe the artist and the architect should be glorifying themselves. If you have a church, you should be doing it quietly, without signing it, without saying I'm Chagall or I'm Corbusier. A master mason was the only person who was allowed to put a mason's mark visibly. And that was because he was recognised as being a very important person. But most masons' marks are always on the bed of the stone, so people know which way round to place it. And also, when they get the size wrong, they can jolly well do it again. So when people say there's a mason's mark here, it shouldn't be there, and it's not anyone saying I'm clever. Now these are for Liverpool Cathedral, the Anglican one. Now he thought Liverpool Cathedral by Charles Gilbert Scott was probably one of the finest Gothic buildings in the world. And it's only just been finished. And a lot of people would say, it's 20th century Gothic, it's a pastiche. But it isn't. And I know when we went on holiday to Spain, my sister was ill with glandular fever and my mother had to stay behind with her, so it was a boys-only outing. We managed to get into a bullfight, but that was only once. otherwise it was a church every day. Anyway, and he was showing us how the Spanish, most of the Spanish architecture was done by the French actually, but Giles Gilbert Scott knew what it was all about, and he wasn't the architect of Liverpool Cathedral, but the dean there was someone he'd grown up with, and he was very keen to have these memorials done to a chapel. They actually stand on the floor, and they're about that high. They're very difficult to tell the scale. But again, this lovely, flying buttresses, little pinnacles, little quirks. They look quite easy to do. It's not till you try to do something like that, you find the balance and the harmony is actually incredibly well thought out. This is Lichfield, St Albans Cathedral, the Chapel of the Holy Spirit, the shrine of St Albans there. And he's done these candlesticks and altar rails and very simple altar. He knew his stone very much. He used to love using fossilised marble. And you can see a light fitting of his up there as well. See how different that is. That's all done in metal. And occasionally things get changed. And I was pleased to see the current architect, I forgot his name now, had to put a ramp in. And he's done it quite well. So he's basically brought my father's work forward, put those candlesticks on there, and there's one of those little hydraulic lifts that go up. It's very nice when you see people respecting work and sharing that quality of work. A lot of people recognise that although my father's materials were modern, they were done to such a high developed scale of craftsmanship that they took on a beauty of their own. You'd always use oak, you'd always use wrought iron, it would be hand forged. This is a church in Manchester, William Temple Memorial Church. And he was I remember him coming back one day and he said, I've just been talking to an engineer and he's shown me this fantastic system of girders where you have holes in them, and if you want to strengthen it in places you just weld in a bit more metal, and it gives that decorative quality. It's very industrial. Mother said, oh dear, she said, poor people in Manchester haven't got enough industry without having to go and worship in a factory. But the clever thing it was he managed to use things like the altar in oak and the wrought iron work. That hand of the craftsman was on it, and it had that. There was absolutely nothing to do with a material being cheap. It was there for a purpose because it defined what my father was trying to do, and everything was literally drawn out full size. You may think most architects do this, but they don't. They rely on the craftsman to do a certain element of the design. And in the old days, it was fantastic. Someone like Comper or the Scott family could let a mason or a metal worker work something out from quite a simple sketch. And if you see some of the drawings the architects did on linen sheets, only one copy, nice colour wash on them, and you think, yeah, that's a nice drawing. And that was it. And the craftsman actually made it work. Well, there aren't any craftsmen brought up in that tradition, the apprentice tradition. They don't really fuse with the architect, and if you don't give them very precise instructions, they'll produce something which makes your hair stand on end. Now that was an early form. You can see how interested he was in structure. This Gothic element again. Architects like Nervi in Italy, were playing with very daring forms and frames. And on the outside, which is at the top there, you'll see it looks fairly straightforward building. It's built with Westmoreland slate and brick. This is in Doncaster. It's hardly had any maintenance whatsoever, except on that flat roof bit, which is amazing because most 20th century buildings leak, probably after the first 10 years. He was also aware you've got to reach these places, and he'd actually have staircases in the tower and access galleries like medieval churches did. They all realised that buildings would have to be maintained. And these used industrial lattice beams. And then this hidden light source, which most people would have a window in the east wall, lots of lovely stained glass. Well, he was very keen on having a very sort of blank wall, where you really focus in and the light would appear just to almost magically come in, which, again, gives it a very modern sense. And then the pulpit and the reading desk were made out of polished granite and marble. So you had these very fine materials. But he also used a lot of equipment, furnishings, which had come from bombed-out churches, because after the war there were an awful lot of spare fittings going about. And he also said that's quite daring. You see that there's a figure at the top there. That's one of Pugin's statues, which is Roman Catholic. But he managed to persuade them it wasn't going to make the Church of England crumble. And he said, this is art, it's the same religion, anyway. And then his new altar rails. But a lot of what he did was what's called the liturgical movement, where the idea was the priest was no longer distant, but was a part of the family of God, part of the worship. And he would face the congregation from behind the altar. I mean, everybody does it now. In fact, it's got to the stage where people are beginning to turn their back on the congregation. It's all going full circle. But at that time, the priest wasn't the father figure he had been in the traditional mould. He wasn't that aloof person. He was someone who would actually join in, have children come into the service. Everything we take for granted today. And this was all, revolutionary in many ways. And although it's a sort of straightforward nave with the chairs facing, the fact that the priest had a wide area around the sanctuary and people could come up and there could be performances took quite a lot of courage for the archdeacons and the bishops and the architect to persuade the local congregation that this was the future and this was the way the church was going to relate to its flock. Now this is in Manchester again. Again, these lattice beams. This is getting a little less fluid. It's got the old pews used again. A little bit. This is between the one you saw earlier at Wythenshawe, which was very industrial, and the one at Doncaster we saw, which was everyone calls it the Ark of God. It was like an upturned boat. But I think it's very unfortunate, that phrase. It's a capsized boat. But there we are. Don't like to disillusion the priest. But the pews he'd stain either dark blue or dark green, which just gave them a different sense from the boring old Victorian softwood staining. You'll see an organ screen on the left. Now it's a screen because so many of these organs were demolished in the war. All their front pipes were wrecked, but the instrument could be cobbled together with something else and reused. And he solved the problem of keeping costs down by having slats in front, and it's a sort of decorative screen through which the sound would come. And you forget there was a very great shortage of materials after the war. You weren't allowed to use some materials at the first 5 years up to 1950. You weren't allowed to use timber. It was all being used for reconstruction of housing and whatnot. And that sort of scale of economy stayed with him a lot. And he was always trying to get a structure which was sort of minimalist structure, but at the same time created its own decoration through its engineering. And then that east window, all those little lights would be filled with stained glass, and you get this blaze of colour in a very plain building. This is at Keele University. Again, those two medieval towers. And as Pesner says, I can't understand it. There should be a door between those two towers. It's not traditional at all. And those peculiar window. He was not a fan, Pesner. He thought my father was, I don't know, he didn't like him. Until towards the end, when he suddenly praised one of his church and said it was a masterpiece. So he obviously managed to persuade people. And here you have, actually, again, these windows are nearly all, there's only 3 sizes there, but they're all put together in a different combination, and you get this sense of a multitude of windows. And the fact that the wall is at an angle, all sorts of architectural tricks. But very traditional materials, again, very sort of maintenance-free. The only thing that didn't work was the skylights at the top. You see those little pop-up things. He liked those. And I remember my mother saying, "Oh, not more of those rabbit ears again." He didn't like it when she criticised him, but she thought it was doing good. And they did leak. So... Now this is going back to Landau, his first commission, major commission, which went on really from 1949 right through to the end of his career. And just in that photograph you can see several stages. You've got this classical pulpit, which is in ebonized oak. You've got one of those light fittings. You've got a screen over there for the organ. The one in the middle is called a positive organ. And it incorporates pre-Raphaelite figures in those little niches, which came from the Victorian church, or the Pritchard design, which was bombed, and he tried to save as much as he could. But the one in the middle is Epstein, Epstein's Christ and Majesty. They didn't want to do Christ crucified, they wanted to do Christ rising. This was the start of a new era. And again, very bold when you consider Epstein was a Jew. And in fact, Glenn Simon and the Dean wanted a piece of art there, and my father wanted a piece of art there, but they couldn't think who to get, who would be sufficiently creative. They went through lots of names, and eventually my father said, "Well, I know you wouldn't want Epstein." And of course they sort of went, that's him. And then they thought, well, Epstein won't want to come and do that either. But he said it was great, and he really wanted to do it. And they sort of sat there, and I remember there's a picture of Epstein and my father holding hands, just looking at the space. And they were there for about 2 hours, just absorbing the atmosphere. But what my father was very keen on, we didn't get some prima donnas. He didn't want artists to be the focal point. So this is quite a dangerous thing to do. And his idea was to bring in artists like Piper, Retchins, Stammers, Roper, then the great name Epstein. But he was very specific, and he said, "This is the space you've got, this is where I want it to go, I want it sort of, it can contrast, but only to a certain degree." He was like a conductor in an orchestra, I suppose you could say. He was trying to make sure nobody stood out from the crowd and was, being pompous and not subverting themselves to the greater cause. So it's all terribly, not democratic, but it was a way of bringing people together as the medieval tradition tended to be, where you didn't really know who designed a cathedral in the old days. He was very much against this modern idiom of pop stars and celebrities. He would have gone mad, I think, today. And then he would acknowledge other people's work. The ceiling is a flat ceiling. In a Gothic church, which wouldn't have had a flat ceiling, it would have had, Pritchard put in this very high-pitched Gothic ceiling. But Sir Charles Nicholson designed this flat ceiling. But my father just felt it would work. He had to give this cathedral qualities. And the main reason for having this, what we call a pulpitum, is to divide the nave from the choir. Now, most cathedrals have a stone screen with an organ on top, and this was the equivalent. But he didn't want a solid screen because that then would divide the space up, and it's not big enough to be, it's not a cathedral size, it's not as big as Westminster Abbey or York Minster, but it's a very grand parish church, but it needed to be made into a cathedral. And he had this idea of having a see-through pulpitum. It's built out of reinforced concrete, and one man dedicated himself, and I think it was 9 months, to tool that concrete with a hammer drill, just to get the right texture. So that's the sort of lengths he felt were appropriate. And it's horrendous. If you go, first time you go to that west door, it either hits you as a monstrous thing, or you just think, gosh, that's amazing. And there are people who have come round to it, and there are people who will never come round to it. But as sure as anything, that would never get permission today. And it just shows how bold they were and how willing they were to make mistakes, which is what artists must be allowed to do. And the choir stalls were designed by him, the light fittings, the organ screens, everything there. But it was done over a long period, so there would be a change in styles, and he evolved as an artist and as an architect. And what he did in the 70s, he certainly hadn't done in the 50s. But somehow it all works, it all pulls together beautifully. And recently they've changed the organ case because the cathedral had a very strong choral tradition, and they wanted to have more scope. And the organ that had gone in was another hodgepodge from some bombed out church. And they felt if they kept his screens, they would be inhibiting the sound. Dear. Anyway, the 20th century very kindly came along with me to defend keeping them. You think something like that, which is such a work of art, would be safe, but there isn't such a thing as anything safe. And there's the screens for the organ, a bit like the one there, which I'm prejudiced, and I felt they couldn't be bettered. But the disappointing thing was when we arrived, there was one of those thermometers outside the church, and it was a 1.1 million appeal for the organ, and it had reached the £1 million mark. I thought, well, I might as well go home, but anyway, they got their way. But, things do change. This is the organ that used to be in that archway, and it's quite nice. It's got these trumpets coming. That was got rid of. I'm not quite sure. I don't know why it was got rid of, but these things happen, and this is what's called evolving, and this is why my father used to say being modern is traditional. That's what happens. Churches evolve. They keep changing. But it's a two-edged sword, because that's what the cathedral used on me. They said, we're evolving. We're having something new. This is King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle, St George's Chapel. You can just see that little, on the dark plan, in the centre, there's a black blob. That's where the chapel is. And nothing had actually been fitted onto this chapel since, I think it was 1600. So it was a very delicate commission, and he was really quite petrified because A, the Queen was involved, and B, this wonderful building. I don't know if you've ever been to St George's, it's fan vaulting. It's a bit like King's College, Cambridge, one of those perfect buildings. And he did an awful lot of different schemes for this. I remember he used it, when I was looking through the files when I was writing my book, he used it as a very useful excuse to keep people at bay. Church wardens would say, you promised this, 6 months ago. He said, I've been commanded by the Queen to do this. You'll have to wait. And they got awful reply came from this church warden. He said, I don't see what the Queen's got to do with our church. So, anyway, there we are. But his secretary once dropped some papers, that's right, on the floor, and his secretary started to pick them up. And then she looked up at him and she said, don't think I'm grovelling at your feet. And he said, I'll have you know, the Queen was grovelling at my feet. It was so embarrassing because she was looking at the drawings on the floor and he didn't know what to do. In the end, he got down because, I mean, you can't stand up when the Queen's down there. But there was he had to reduce it. The cost came in too high. There were some things he would have liked to have done, but wasn't able to in the end. But he was able to explore the screen. This is built out of Clipsham, which is actually a limestone. It's quite bright. But if you go there now, it's the same colour as the rest of it. Again, it's very difficult to persuade people not to tone things down. If you actually darken stone down, it darkens eventually to more than it should be. So you've got to be patient with these things. I'll just go back to that one. What was interesting, you'll see that there's a gutter, a stone chute in one of those buttresses taking the water out of the roof. I don't know if you maybe can't see it, but I remember my father was getting quite agitated and he came rushing through. He said, I've solved it. I'm going to take the rainwater through the buttress. Now, that doesn't sound much to most people, but a buttress is a very significant part of a building, and especially a fan-vaulted building, a stone vault. You don't mess about with buttresses. But it was the only way he could get it through without having a rainwater pipe ruining the front. And I remember my brother Martin said, well, I could have told you that. He had a lot to put up with, I think, with that. Those are the wrought iron gates, which you saw the finial at the very beginning. That's it. That's the final version up the top there. And I think he was a bit disappointed that the royal family didn't fully appreciate it. But they like horses. They don't like wrought iron railings. Sir Hugh Casson, who was the president of the RA at the time, he took my father aside and he said, "I've never seen anything like that." So that made up for it. Again, it's this understanding of Gothic and how Gothic has orders to it, different planes and different hierarchy. And once you sort of understood all that, they become much more impact than you could believe. He would often make things using old materials, and this is it. Lichfield? No, it isn't. St Albans, is it? Oh gosh, is it Lichfield? No. Chester, yes, Chester. Oh, well done, Giles. Yes, that's right. Yes, took some old Jacobean panels and things and put them together. He hated, not using things, and there's a magnificent screen. Again, is it the one at Chester? There was one in Salisbury, Lichfield. No, the Lichfield. There was a beautiful brass wrought iron screen, which was taken out of Salisbury Cathedral, a very similar one, and he persuaded them to keep this one against everybody. Everybody was, it was Victorian vulgarity in those days. And there's a pulpit there as well, at Lichfield. And he says, not everybody loves this, but they will learn to do so. He was convinced, and of course now they are priceless. Now, St Albans, I've got this one right. He made those using veneered plywood, and the Dean and Chapter and the Friends of the Cathedral went, that's not good enough, we want proper materials. And he said if that had been available to the medievalist, they would have used them. They would have used concrete blocks if the medievals had their way. They painted everything anyway. So, but again, it was this ability. He knew when he had to use the best materials, and there's a bishop's throne from Wakefield there, and there's some Neela, but he just felt he was using old material, the old bench ends from the choir stalls, and oak supports, but the panels he made out of plywood, and you can't tell, it's got an oak veneer, but he defended it, and I always quite admired the way he would not be traditional for the sake of it. He was quite prepared to explore new things. This is carving. This is in Llandaff Regimental Chapel. Again, all full-sized out by himself. Most people would think stonemasons do that without thinking. Well, nobody does anything without thinking. Everything has to be designed. And he found not only could he not fit all the names on, but they couldn't be read if they were squashed too much. So he devised a system where some of the letters actually cross each other. And then if you go and look at some Roman inscriptions, you'll find they did that in Roman times. So nothing new, but he sees it as a form of art. You can read it, but the primary object is not to read it clearly. It's to have it as part of the design for the whole. And these are the fallen members of the regiment. But beautiful, as good as anything Eric Gill would have done. This was a development where he went into three-dimensional lettering and used a system using polystyrene to cut the letters. He had a sculptor who developed this technique. And what you do is you put the polystyrene into a sand mould, and then you pour liquid aluminium in, and the aluminium melts the polystyrene. It's like a lost wax system. Unfortunately, it creates rather poisonous fumes, and the sculptor had to give up after a while. He became ill, but find these things out. But he's terribly pleased because he's got these, not only they overlap, they're coming out on different planes. This is in Durham Cathedral, chapel, the Bede Chapel. It's all gilded as well. He loved using gold, which it is a wonderful material, gold leaf. He also went into textiles. I remember when my father died and I was clearing out drawings from his office, I took these in to the staff. And I said, what do they know about them? And they said, oh, no, he didn't do these. These nothing to do with him. And I said, well, they are, because here are the drawings and here's his name on them. But he would do things at weekends which nobody else knew about in the office. And he used people like Beryl Dean and embroiderers to work with him on new techniques. And again, this is gold thread. And he loved doing this because he said you don't have to worry about it leaking or fitting particularly. I mean, chasuble copes, they sort of hang on you anyway. So, and of course, when they hang on someone, they look different. All the folds. I mean, it's like fashion designers, and he would turn his hand to so many things. And again, you can see the Gothic elements in there. Loads of those little spiky bits. Here it is on. It still works. I mean, and you have to be so careful. Things like that, they're not treated as works of art. If they're slightly out of fashion, I've been into churches where vestments have been designed by Temple Moore or even Compa, and they're just stuck in a drawer and they're going mouldy, and you think, oh gosh. So anyway, hopefully, I know they appreciate. These are from St Albans, and we do appreciate those. This is an altar frontal at Lichfield, which is the gridiron of St Lawrence, and he did a little cross at the top of Lichfield Cathedral on the spire, St Lawrence cross, and out of that he got a chapel in Africa, a cathedral in Africa, and Keele University. So, as he said, you never know. You've always got to do the best you can, whatever you do, because somebody will see it and they'll hopefully like it. But that's got silver leather as well as gold thread. But that's the sort of the Mondrian or the sort of the modern art coming through. But it's him. It's still him. And it was something he just couldn't get round. His very recognisable style, and this great strive he had to be self-effacing in the face of God was, I'm afraid he just produced something wonderful. And there we are. This is using old bits, this is Beverley Minster, no, that's Mary's Beverley, using an old 15th century doorway, with the screen. Again, he'd lime it to make it all blend together. He used to love lime from his Norfolk days in churches. This is Southwark Cathedral. That's a Pugin tabernacle. Tabernacles aren't allowed by law in England to be on the altar, so he was dicing with death on this one anyway, and it's Roman Catholic. But he managed to persuade them in the end. And it's a sort of meditation place. It's called the Harvard Chapel because the people from Harvard have donated money towards it. There's some connection with the Harvard who founded Harvard University. But this is the first job I did for him. There's a radiator behind that grill there. And he said, just pop up. This was when I was running the London office. I was a student in a flat in London. So I did my year out with him. And he immediately put York and London on the headed paper. And all the staff went, have we been taken over? Anyway, and he said, just go and check it out. So I thought, this will be easy. And it was the next day when the American ambassador was coming. And the workmen were there, and they hadn't done the radiator. And I said, get on with it. And they said, we can't, because there's no valves. We have to drain the whole cathedral down, and it'll be a disaster. I said, well, just saw the pipe and bung it with a towel or something like you do when you don't know what you're talking about. And anyway, in the end, all this nonsense. So I said, just give it to me, I'll do it. And they sort of went, we can freeze it. We'll go and get some, whatever that gas is. So they froze it. And they said, be very careful, because when the plug of ice is there, it'll be under such pressure, it could come out like a bullet. Anyway, I was getting fed up with it. They cut it, and there was this lump of ice, and it fell out, and the water went blub, blub. And that was the first and last time, I believe, a contractor. Obviously messing me about, so there we are. You learn these things the hard way. This is Martin the Grand. This was a bombed-out church in York. The German government helped pay for its restoration, which was one of those first acts of whatever. He took the west window, the east window, that big window there on the right, which used to be up here in the nave, which had been destroyed. He took it and built a little transept. So it had a lot of medieval glass in it, which had been taken out, fortunately. Dean Milner White had the sense to take all the glass out of York Minster and these churches. It was put back in. The idea wasn't to recreate the whole church, because it was too big. But everything in there, again, he has designed. He's designed the pews, he's designed the railings. The organ was a very early experiment to get a see-through organ, so you could see the light coming through from the west window. And it was also what we call a direct tracker system. So many organs in the 50s were electronic in the sense that when you pressed a key, it made a circuit join up and it opened a valve. Well, with the direct tracker one, it's like a piano. When you put your finger on the key, it makes it operate through a series of pulleys, and it means it's a more sensitive instrument. And this was the first. It's a bit like sort of like the early music revival, where period instruments were used. But he wanted it to be a pretty little organ. He didn't want it to be sort of clumping up the place. The ceiling is his special tracery he developed in these colours he loved. It looks medieval until you actually look closely. Quite clearly it's not medieval. There's a row of figures, a little gold row of figures between one of those arches. It's a reredos. It was designed by Roper, and it was too avant-garde for the church. It was supposed to go above the high altar, and they wouldn't have it. So it was stuck there. He was very cross about it. But now, at last, they've put it where it should be. So, isn't that great?
I'm here to say, are you about 5 minutes off the
Well,
end?
less than that. I think that's only 2 to go. I'm sorry. That's the trouble. There's always too much. When I wrote my book, it could have been twice as long. But it was going to start off as a series of photographs, but you can't just put photographs and expect people to understand what they're looking at. He wrote so many articles and went to so many conferences and tried to get his message across that it's just as important. What we've got here, next one is a little Victorian church in, well, it's not Victorian, it's been Victorianised at a time, but a lot of what you see there it doesn't strike you as being odd, I suppose, but he took the plaster off the chancel arch wall, for example, exposed that stonework. He painted the gallery. Instead of a wood grain colour, it's a deep greeny blue. Painted the roof trusses, new benches, relaid the floor with brick and stone, took the plaster off the bottom half of the wall to stop damp coming through and things like that. And got a little, Harry Harvey did that little crucifix up there. Bringing the artists together and liming the Jacobean pulpit. Lots of little touches which took a very ordinary Victorian interior into something like a little gem. And he was very, very good at that. Made the whole thing work. And my mother always used to say, it's not until it's actually in use that it really comes to life, which I think is quite an attribute, because most architects don't want people in their pictures. They get in the way. But if a building's in use and it works as well. And there's a church in Sheffield, St Mark's. I went there recently. And they were just saying how wonderful it is when it's empty and when it's full. So that's great. But I think the last one is, yes, that's Chester Cathedral. Now I don't know why I put that in because it hasn't come out very well. It should be in colour. It's all gold. Again, it's using those tracery patterns. I think there are 5 different ones, and they're all, moved in different ways. And again, it looks terribly complicated, but actually, when you break it down into elements, it's simple. But, anyway, I could go on, so I won't.
I don't want to cut you short, but we've had a feast.
Good.
And thank you very much. I think it's fascinating in all sorts of ways. Church architecture at that period is, I think, always richer than we think. That the 20th century society has been giving a lot of time and attention lately to putting together the knowledge required to sort of get an overview of architecture. This is now in the form of a database which has just gone online today. Indeed, yes, which is fantastic. And this is your thing, Bobby. Yes, a brilliant job.
Susanna.
Sorry?
And
Susanna. Yes. So do look on our website, and you'll find all sorts of exciting things you didn't know about, I'm sure. And the thing that interests me particularly is sort of being somewhere between the historical and the modern, which it was always a very difficult position to be in, I think, and he made a tremendous success of it.
I think the important thing is he chose to go there because he felt that was the only direction that would really work.
Yes.
For a building which was religious, trying to promote Christianity.
Yes.
Which it isn't a compromise. He has actually developed something which has never been done before. And I think that's quite an achievement.
Yeah. So any questions? Yes, Margaret.
I wonder, did you work with the sculptor Geoffrey Clark? You mentioned he was casting aluminium.
That was Roper, not Clark.
And Geoffrey used to cast aluminium.
Did he? Yes.
He worked in churches a lot.
Did he work? Oh, I see. Well, it did. It caught on. Quite a few people took this on, to be honest. But it was Roper who brought it to my father. Now, he may have got it from somebody else, I don't know, but it was just unfortunate. It was a wonderful medium because you had a hot wire and you can carve polystyrene ever so easily. And then there's this awful problem with fumes. Who did, sorry?
Henry Moore.
Did he?
His
Yes.
assistants used to do that.
Oh, did they?
Yes.
Oh, right. Oh, right.
Right.
Yes, it
Almost
would be.
outdoors they were, weren't they?
Yeah.
Sort of plastic sheeting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh,
It's not really a question. But when one's planning an event, and
Mhm.
you're looking at the pedal, and you hear that there's a church, even altered by your father,
Mhm.
and you go there, and it's always very, very rewarding.
Yeah.
Much better than you think it's going to be. And it's really interesting. You described that Victorian chapel, where it didn't say where it was, but how he embellished is not quite the word I want to use. Transform. is
Yes.
better. I remember we did an event in Lincoln, a tribute to Sam Scorer, who was the arch person of building hyperbolic parabola. That was his trade. And he built a church, which leads, of course, in his greatest style, with St John Ermine. We also went, and Keith New, who I think she's in the audience.
Yes.
Uh,
Well, Keith New worked with your father at Branston.
Ah, yes.
Branston. It's Branston I was coming on to.
Yes.
And Keith New did, so a totally modern church, and Keith New did the glass there. Scorer knew him through the Digswell project in Welling Garden City.
Mm.
And then Keith New did an even better window, in my view, at Branston,
Aye.
which was a medieval church burnt out
Mm.
in about 62, and then completely redone by your father. A very typical commission piece, I think.
Yes, yes.
And it's extremely successful, but undervalued by the parishioners. They were kind of astonished when it was great.
Oh dear.
Because they wanted a medieval church, and that it isn't.
Yes,
that,
yes.
It's a modern church.
He was very keen to keep what could be salvaged
Oh,
too.
yes, yeah. But having looked at pictures of it post-fire in the Lincoln paper, it was totally,
Yes.
totally burnt out.
Yes,
But
yes.
it just showed, I think I very much appreciate the way you brought out how he did it, collaborating with stained glass artists like you, not Clark, Margaret, but possibly Roper and other figures. And also, I think his sense of paintwork was really fantastic. And that comes across
It
from
was.
Branston.
It was, yes.
And these kind of lime, this blue and green.
He did paint, one of his early commissions was an organ case in Pocklington near York. And he did it with purples and gold and silver, and everybody hated it. And Pesner said that toffee papered organ case. Generally exceedingly rude.
Professionally rude about everything.
Yes.
That's why we need revised editions of Pesner to cut out the rudeness.
Yes. But I wouldn't say it grew on people because it's been altered and it has been muted and changed. But even my mother said, she's a very good critic, she said, I don't think that's going to go down well. See, he used to like balsam, that pink you get with balsam. You sort of pick it out of the hedgerow and say, that's what I want. That's a medieval colour. And because it was medieval, everyone should like it. But anyway, that's...
Really?
Just a quick comment.
mhm.
I've been to London and it's beautiful and sounding and wonderful. Thank you.
No, good. Well, I'm glad you like it because, yeah, I think everyone should go there, even if you don't like it.
One more there.
You made a connection between the nails, which your father used,
Mhm.
and the Graham Sullivan nails.
Yes.
There.
Yes.
You showed us the Doncaster church with its
Yeah.
blank east wall,
Yes.
apart from the little Puget.
Yeah. Mm.
And I just wondered what your father's attitude to Coventry Cathedral was, with the big tapestry there and such tremendous works from a variety of artists, whether he felt they fitted together or whether they were themselves in a way
Yes.
in conflict with one another.
He had mixed feelings on Coventry. He regarded it as a lost opportunity in that it was not a modern building, it was not a modern liturgy. It was very traditional. And he felt something which perhaps an altar in the round like they did at Liverpool with the Roman Catholic Cathedral. But he loved Graham Sutherland, and he liked the elements that I don't know. I think it was a difficult one because he was going to go in for the competition, and I think our mother said, "You better be very careful because these competitions have a habit of biting you back, and I'll steer clear of that one." I think there was always a slight element of jealousy that Basil Spence got it and done what he'd done, and my father was probably rather hypercritical and thought he would have done it better. I don't know. This is me surmising. He would never explain things like that, but just the way. And we did go and see it as a family, but I suppose he actually probably came out thinking it was better than he was expecting. I mean, I think it's a good building. I like it, but it's got lots of very nice elements. But as a sort of whole, inside, that there's a certain lack of. I don't know. It's still rather bare and rather big. But, anyway.
I think
The pavilion
your
of
mother
religious
was right
art,
about
Sandy
the use of people coming in.
Yes.
I felt my attitude to it changed very much the first time I went, which was about a year later.
Yes.
And about 3 years later, and I felt the place had been traded and somehow had come into more of a unity.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll stop there. Thank you, Peter, very much.
Right.